Folks, welcome to our class tonight. Appreciate everybody being here, and hope that we will all learn something tonight in our studies. But I do appreciate your being here. All of you who are on streaming and watching us, thank you for doing that. It's always encouraging to find out that there are quite a number of people who are watching on streaming. So all of you guys, thank you so much. We appreciate you too. If you are visiting with us, we welcome you, and we hope that you'll stay around at the end of the class and at least let me get to know you. But we do appreciate it so much, all of you who might be visiting with us. If you're not visiting with us, or if you are visiting, we're studying the book of Mark, and the topic of our classes is Jesus through the eyes of Mark. And I'm very prejudiced toward the book of Mark. I think it's just an outstanding book in the Bible, and there's so much going on, and helps us to learn more and more about Jesus than maybe more information about him than in any of the other three Gospels, certainly more than in John. So I'm glad that you're here. We can study that, but thank you for coming. If you're first time on streaming, thank you for being there as well. We need to mention, as we do each week, we do have two elders. If you are visiting with us, we have two elders at the back of the auditorium. Go right through these doors and toward the library, which is just straight, and there'll be two elders there. If you have any needs, if you need prayers, if you just need to discuss something with our elders, if you have some physical needs, whatever it might be, they're there, and they're glad to help you if you need to change the direction of your life. They'll be glad to take care of that. So we appreciate our elders. We have wonderful elders, and we just appreciate them so much. And so if any of you have any of those needs, please go there. We have a lot of folks who are sick this week, as we do each week, but we have some more deaths. I think Bonnie and I, my wife Bonnie and I, were talking yesterday. I believe after Sonny Tillman passed away, I believe he was either the 12th or 13th person since January 1st. That's just a lot of folks who've passed away. It's very sad, and we've had just far too many people who have died, and so we certainly want to remember the families of these people. Billy Prince, of course, passed away last week, and his funeral was held. And Sonny Tillman's, he passed away, and his funeral will be, actually graveside service tomorrow. Visitation starts at 3, I believe it's 3 to 6 at Sellers, right? Is that where his body is? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah. And so anyway, if you would like to visit with that family. Also this morning, we looked on Facebook and saw that Brent Fetzer's sister had passed away, and that's a saddening thing too. And so please remember in your prayers Judy Prince and Sonny's family, large family, and also Brent's family, Brent and all of his family. So please remember them. Other people that we need to remember is Albert England is still dealing with some problems, and we hope that you will remember him. David is going to have some surgery in May, so that's a little bit far in advance, but please keep David in mind. Doug and Sharon Perry's daughter is in a high-risk pregnancy with twins, and they've asked us to pray for her. So in your private prayers, if you would, please remember her. Jim Pugh is doing better, but he still needs our prayers. Bobby Cole, Glenda Franklin, Sharon Tigert, and my granddaughter Abby is doing fairly well. She's had all of her they've done every test they can do, and everything has turned out without a problem so far. So just please remember her in your prayers, if you would can remember her name. Carol Hackney, we want to, in our private prayers, remember her. Jim and Mert Ray, Dwayne Griffin, of course, has been fighting his battles, but Griff is doing much better. Jerry and Virginia Reynolds, we want to mention them. Anita Borski who lost her husband. We want to remember her. And the young man, 10-year-old Javon Baskin, as we mentioned several weeks in a row, he's a foster child of the Haynes family, and he's been diagnosed with cancer, and he's undergoing treatments. And I want you to please remember in your prayers, if you would, Lilia Davidson, Philip Davidson's wife. She's taking chemo treatments, and she's doing better. Philip just told me a few moments ago that she was doing better, but she's had a time with some of the treatments. So if you can remember Lilia, please remember her in your prayers. But anyway, she's hoping to come back to church after Easter. She'll be able to come back, hopefully. So anyway, a lot of folks hurting. So we're going to go to God and ask him to remember all of these folks and to take care of them. And so if you will, bow with me, and we'll do that, and then we'll be ready to start.
Aaron Jones has taken Miss Sue to the emergency room Midtown.
Okay.
That just happened. And the twins have passed away. The Perry's twins.
Okay. I did not know that. Did you guys hear him? David, he didn't hear it, and you know I hear like Helen Keller, so I didn't hear it all either.
You didn't hear that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Come up here where we can, yeah.
No. Yeah, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but Aaron Jones is with Miss Sue at St. Thomas Midtown at the ER, waiting to be seen. And Doug Perry's two grandkids, babies, have passed. No heartbeat.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so.
Well, that's sad.
Yeah,
That is
yeah,
sad. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And hang on just a moment, if you will. Okay. Is this too loud, or is it rattling or anything? Can you hear it? Okay, good deal. Okay, tonight it's going to be easy to keep up with the reading. If you want to turn to Mark 1, we're going to go straight through all of Mark 1 and into Mark 2, the first 12 verses of Mark 2. So that's going to be our entire lesson. So you won't have to flip from here to there. If we have time at the end of the class, which I hope we do, we're going to talk about demons for a little bit, even though that will come later in Mark 5 and 9. But we're going to talk something about demons, and if we have time. So there'll be a couple of scriptures there if we get to that. But anyway, just start with 1 and start with Mark 1:21 and go right straight through to 2:12, and you'll be with us the whole time. So again, we're talking tonight about Jesus through Mark's eyes, the miracle worker. And that's several years ago, and I know all of you in here probably are familiar with that. Several years ago, a powerful drama was written by a guy named William Gibson, and he entitled his play "The Miracle Worker." And it was a story about probably one of the most amazing mortals who ever walked the earth, Helen Keller. And when we talk about her, she's just such a marvelous, marvelous human being. And it became a bestseller, that drama did. And it was an award-winning Broadway play, and then made it into a critically acclaimed film. So it was a very popular play. What made that play so successful and the film so successful was its depiction of courage, the courage and the intelligence and the tenacity of a blind young lady, a girl who could neither speak nor speak nor hear. And she had a disease when she was just a toddler. And so she lost her hearing and her speech. And as you well know, there's only two ways we learn to speak, and that's by hearing and seeing. And if you can't do those two things, you never learn to speak. But she did. And she learns to speak in such a powerful way, one of the most intelligent people that this world has ever known. And so she is a marvelous lady. She was from Tuscumbia. I'm sure some of you have been there. She lived in Tuscumbia. And if you haven't been there, it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours from here. It's a very close drive to Tuscumbia. you need to go down there and see her house and see all the things that they have there that talk about her. They have a play there. They do that play once every day, maybe once every night. But anyway, it's a marvelous story about a marvelous lady. She died a few years ago. In fact, very few years ago in my lexicon. She died in 1968, which has only been 56 years ago. And so that's relatively young for me. I mean, relatively short time. So this is the woman we talk about. We talk about the miracle worker, but as overpowering as her ability was to learn to speak, and the miracle worker actually is Annie Sullivan, the woman who taught her to do that. And so she was a marvelous lady herself. And so the marvelous things that they did earned Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan the words miracle worker. But we all know the true miracle worker was not Annie Sullivan. It was Jesus Christ. And tonight's lesson, we get a glimpse of this man, the Son of God, performing miracles and the way that Mark sees those miracles. And so we're going to be talking about that tonight. And again, we start with Mark 1:21, and we'll go all the way to chapter 2, verse 12. So here's what Mark says as he tells us about what happened there. Then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teachings, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Now there was a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And when the unclean spirit had convulsed him and cried out with a loud voice, he came out of him. Then they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately his fame spread throughout all the regions around Galilee. Now, as soon as they had come out of the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick with a fever, and they told him about her at once. So he came, he took her by the hand, and he lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she served them. At evening, when the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick and all those who were demon-possessed. And the whole city was gathered together at the door. Then he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he did not allow the demons to speak, because they knew him. Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." But he said to them, "Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, because for this purpose I have come forth." And he was preaching in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and casting out demons. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be willing, be clean." As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was clean. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded, as a testimony to them." However, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in deserted places, and they came to him from every direction. And then going to chapter 2, verse 1. And again he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. Immediately many gathered together, so that there was no longer room to receive them. And he preached, and not even the door, and he preached the word to them. Then they came to him, bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men. And when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." And some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" But immediately, when Jesus perceived in their spirit, his spirit, that they reasoned this thus within themselves, he said to them, "Why do you reason about these things in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Arise, take up your bed and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, arise, take up your bed and go to your house." Immediately he arose, took up his bed and went out in the presence of them. So all were amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw anything like this." A lot of stuff happening. I mentioned in the introduction a while back when we had the first lesson, the book of Mark is interesting because things just keep moving. It seems that things are just, Jesus particularly, is moving a lot from here to there, doing the work that he came to the earth to do, to teach the gospel. And so he is, it's a book of movement. So as we read this, I know it's almost tiring when you get through because you've read so many things that have happened. But that's Mark for you. He's much like the Apostle Peter, as we talked about before. Peter was a man of action, and Mark was influenced greatly by Peter. And so he's that kind of person to move so quickly. Coming back to the very first verse, it talks about Jesus entering. The verse says that he entered into Capernaum in the synagogue and began to teach. It's interesting that about how teaching took place in the first century and before the first century, actually. The New Bible Commentary says that once a king of Israel, remember Israel had kings before the New Testament had been written, that once a king of Israel had been anointed, proclaimed, and given God's Spirit for the task, he had to go out and prove his calling, and that commentary is on Mark 1:21 that I just mentioned. Jesus was now about 30 years old, which was the traditional age for a Jewish man to begin to teach others. Rarely, if ever, did a Jewish man teach in the synagogue if he were under 30 years of age. So Jesus is about 30. It's the beginning of his ministry, which will last about 3 years, 3+ years, and teaching other people. So here's this young man in his 30s, the Son of God, doing some of his earliest teachings in the synagogue of Capernaum. One of the interesting things about that synagogue, it seems to be one of the most central parts of the New Testament. If you remember, Jesus spent most of his time in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Galilean area. And so he was in the synagogues, all of the synagogues, but the one that you're talking about here is very interesting. It was the original synagogue that Jesus taught on. The foundation is still there. An earthquake destroyed the one synagogue where Jesus was in about the year 363. But there were others, they built on top of this foundation. So they were destroyed, of course, by armies and other people, other things. But the synagogue in which Jesus went was the foundation of it is still standing today. It's really interesting. When you go there, they show you the ruins of the temple and the synagogue with the pillars and so forth. There's a few pillars standing. But the bottom part of it is made out of rock, and it's where Jesus actually stood. We were fortunate enough many years ago, my wife and I, to go there. And it was, to me, that was the highlight of the trip, was to see the foundation of that synagogue where Jesus actually stood. So you could go up and stand on the floor of where he actually stood. That's where he was teaching. Right across the road from that, a small road, was the house of Peter, which is what is mentioned in our reading just a moment ago. Peter's house was apparently very well built, because almost all archaeologists today are of a complete, almost completely agree that the ruins of Peter's house are there. And so you get to see the concrete stone foundation of his house, and it's just directly across from Capernaum, from the synagogue at Capernaum. So it's a very interesting place. Jesus spent most of his time, probably when he was teaching in Galilee, in the area of Galilee, he spent his time more than likely in Peter's house. And so that's where all of this miracle takes place here of the paralytic, where Peter's mother-in-law was healed. All of this took place in this one little area, and it was a very popular place. And as Jesus did these things, more and more crowds gathered. You can just imagine people who had someone in their family who was possessed with a demon, someone who was ill for any reason, someone who was like this paralytic, been paralyzed from his birth. And nobody could ever do anything for him. And his friends brought him, and they couldn't get in the house, so they knocked the roof open, brought him down, and of course, Jesus healed him. And those Jewish scribes and Pharisees who thought they knew everything, and they said, "You can't forgive sins, only God can forgive sins." And Jesus said, "Well, let me ask you this, is it easier to say your sins are forgiven, or tell him to take up his bed and walk?" And he said, "So that I can prove to you who I am, take up your bed and walk." And that young man got up, and it would have been like a cot, but he got up, put the cot on his back, and he walked out. And you can just imagine again what that did for his reputation in Galilee and all over Israel, to be perfectly frank. And so people began to say, this man is not a man. He's more than that. He's got to be God in the flesh, because only God could do the things that he's doing. So it was a very interesting time during this that we just read here. Last week we talked about Mark parading a series of witnesses to prove that Jesus was the Son of God. So we talked about that if you were here. And he showed us Jesus' baptism and his endorsement by God with the Father, by the Holy Spirit descending in the form of a dove. So we talked about that. So that impressed people tremendously as well. But when it came down to most people saw people being healed, that seems to be the one thing that just completely caused massive crowds to gather. And I've often wondered about Peter's house, because that's where much of this took place, or many of these took place. It must have been a terrible thing to try to run a household, and you've got people hanging around the house all the time waiting for Jesus. Even when he was out in the wilderness or out in the byways teaching and preaching, these people were gathered there waiting for him to come back, hoping they could see him or even touch him or whatever. And his calling in some most spectacular ways, he does this through miracles. So the real miracle worker was not Annie Sullivan or Helen Keller. The real miracle worker was Jesus Christ. If you notice that Mark records miracles here as the casting out of demons, and that's not just the paralytic being healed, but demon possession was even more probably common. In fact, it was more common than being paralyzed. So there were demons possessing people's bodies in the New Testament. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. And when we get to Mark 5 and 9, chapter 5 and chapter 9. We'll get into it quite well. But anyway, Mark proceeds to show us that Jesus proves who he says he is, and that is the Son of God, because no one could ever do what he did unless he was possessed of power that's far beyond anything a human being could do. If you notice that Mark records the Jewish miracles here as the casting out the man in Capernaum again. And this caused his fame to spread rapidly. And as I just said, apparently demon possession was a lot more common than we might think. And apparently so many people, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see so many people who were possessed by these demons. And again, if we have time at the end of class, we'll be talking a little bit more about them and a couple of things. Do they exist today? Or are the demons on the earth today? And if so, do they ever possess people? So we're going to talk about that a little bit in a few minutes if we have time. Many have said that demon possession, particularly those who are skeptical of when they read about demons in the Bible, they say there was nothing to that. It was mental illness. That's all it was. And that is not only not true, but all the evidence in the Bible completely debunks that. It was not mental illness. It was evil spirits who, either by invitation of the person who allowed him to come into his body or her body, or some other way, those demons possessed people. And we don't know all the details of it because the Bible doesn't tell us all of that. But what are those and how do they exist? And again, we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. They seem to be, as I mentioned, evil spirits. And in large measure, they seem to exercise tremendous control over that person. And it was a horrible thing. People who had relatives who were demon possessed, they would go into these spasmodic ramblings and yelling and whatever, and it was apparently painful too. And the only way that they could be brought out of that person was by Jesus. There is no recorded way that anybody was ever able to get rid of a demon except Jesus. So so Jesus knew how horrible it was to be a person and be possessed by one of these evil spirits. As we'll talk about, I mentioned in Mark 5 and 9, but a little bit tonight, the definitive passages on demon possession and its effects are in those two chapters, so we'll spend a lot more time then, so just come back when we do Mark 5 and 9. So it's easy to see why, with such horrible effects of such possession, Jesus' control over them would cause him to become known extremely rapidly. And that is so true. The people, mentioned a while ago how horrible it was to have a family member who was possessed. Sometimes they would throw themselves into the fire, or the demon would cause them to fall into the fire. They'd do all kinds of things that were painful, and in some cases even would kill themselves because of the demon possession. Then we read, after we talk a little bit about the demons there, we read where Simon Peter's mother-in-law was very ill. And when the Bible says someone is very ill, they're very ill. It's not like a cold or a light case of the flu or something. So we don't know what was wrong with her, but Peter's mother was sick. And so everybody was concerned for her, apparently. And so Jesus, being in her house a lot, he knew that she was sick, and so he healed her. And that impressed many people in the city of Jesus, which is Capernaum. Maybe all of the area beyond Capernaum, like all of Galilee. After she was healed, Peter's house, the one I referred to a while ago, became the center point of Jesus' ministry almost, because people began to come there. The word would get out. Here's what this marvelous man can do. And he's more than a man. He can do all these marvelous things. You need to see him. You need to bring your people, if they are demon possessed, if they're paralyzed, whatever they might be, you need to take them to him, because he can do things that no human being could possibly do unless God was with him. So it came to be, as I mentioned earlier, came to be so crowded that Peter's house apparently was more like just a highway house where everybody was coming and going, and everybody was hoping to see Jesus. Of course, Jesus didn't stay there all the time, but he was there enough that people would sit there, and probably it is estimated that people would camp out near his house, because they felt like that he would come to Peter's house at some point, maybe to rest, or maybe just to come for a meal or whatever. So they would camp out and wait and bring their sick folks with them, and they would sit there and wait and hoping that he would happen. It only took a few hours when he did show up for the word to spread throughout all of Galilee. By the way, you may be interested in knowing, when we talk about Jesus in Capernaum, why was he not doing these things in Nazareth? Why was his birthplace? Well, he was born in Bethlehem, but where he lived as a child and grew up. Why weren't these things happening in Nazareth? We don't know. But if you remember, his family didn't believe that Jesus was God. They didn't believe in his divinity, and until the resurrection, or some of them until the resurrection, and some of them the crucifixion. But his family didn't even believe that he was what he said he was. And I've always wondered, if they came from Nazareth, which wasn't that far away, to Capernaum, and they saw what he did, why would they not believe? And surely some of his family were there, but they didn't. So it's always been a strange thing that happened. They told him when Jesus was more than likely very exhausted at the end of every day. Can you imagine preaching and teaching to people who want to hear you, and then healing them, doing all of these marvelous things that he did? At the end of the day, he's 30 years old, but 30-year-old people get tired too. And he was worn out. He absolutely had to be worn out at the end of every day. And he had to have some rest. But he always got up early the next morning, and he went out to pray. And that was the highlight of his life, it seems, was he prayed and talked to his Father every morning. So it's a marvelous example of love in action, love enough so that you don't worry about yourself, and you don't worry about whether you're tired or not. You worry about doing the will of God, and you worry about, you concern yourself, is a better way to say it, you concern yourself with doing those things which are going to show people who I am, that I am of God, I am a part of God, I am God's son. I want you to know that. And so that's reason, and he was apparently many times was worn out. Jesus told them when they would gather, he said that teaching was one of his main missions. We read that in our reading a while ago. It's one of his main jobs. I came to teach, I came to preach, and I came to tell everyone about God and tell them about me, and to tell them why I came to this earth. And so he felt very responsible when he was on the earth to do all of that, and he worked very hard at it. He said that was his mission. One of his missions was teaching. So he teaches while he's casting out demons to so many. We have a leper coming to him, as we read a while ago, to be cleansed. And it's difficult, again, for you and me to understand leprosy. Leprosy was today it is called Hansen's disease, and people are still being treated for it today. In fact, at this very moment, there used to be about 3 or 4 leprosariums or leper hospitals during the last century, And most of them, I think, have closed now, maybe all of them. The last one, I think, was in Louisiana. But people had leprosy in America and throughout the world. But there were drugs that were developed, and those drugs controlled leprosy. So someone could have leprosy, and he today, if he has it, he goes to a doctor, there are drugs that control it. My understanding is it doesn't cure it, but it controls it so that there are no symptoms. But things were totally different in the time that we're talking about right now. In those days, it was a horrible, horrible, literal rotting of the flesh. If you had leprosy and it got on your fingers, your finger would rot off and drop to the ground. And you can imagine all the nerve endings in the end of your fingers that allow people to read, the deaf to read, the blind to read Braille. Can you imagine how many nerve endings we have in our fingers? One of those fingers just rots off. And other places, the skin on the face, just a whole chunk of skin would come off. And then they died, of course, but they had to reach a certain point of almost intense pain before they died. They were fortunate enough to pass away. Horrible, horrible thing. And this leper that Jesus healed, he was so happy to be cleansed that he went out telling everyone, even though Jesus told him not to do so. And once the word spread very rapidly, and hundreds probably of people who knew someone who was stricken with leprosy told somebody else, and the first thing you know, all of these folks are coming to Jesus. They want to be healed of this horrible disease called leprosy. And by the way, when they had leprosy, it was not just the physical part, it was the total social isolation, as all of you know. There were leper colonies, and many of those leper colonies were located like in a valley, and nobody would get near the people, and they had to be fed, of course, and so they would just drive by and throw food over the hills for the people to run out and pick up and to eat. And then it was a death valley where these things were. So leprosy was more than you and I can imagine how horrible it was. So people wanted to see Jesus because they knew they'd heard too many people saying, this man can do that. Then Jesus, after he does that, he returns to Capernaum, in all likelihood, again, back to Peter's house. And there are so many people that can hardly maneuver. And so these friends bring this young man who is one of their friends who is paralyzed. We don't know why. He probably was born that way, but he could have suffered it in a fall or whatever. But anyway, he was paralyzed and probably had been paralyzed for much of his life. And they bring him on a bed or a stretcher type of contraption for Jesus to heal him. But they can't get to Jesus. Peter's house is full of people. There are people out in the yard, people in the road, people over in the synagogue across the road. They can't get there. There's no way they're going to get this man there. But his friends love him so much that they decide, we're going to get him in there. We're going to see Jesus one way or the other. So they go up on the top of the house, the roof, and they literally tear a hole in Peter's house's roof to let their friend down to see Jesus. When Jesus sees this man, he cannot believe the faith that all of them, including the paralytic, have in him. He not only heals him physically, but he heals him spiritually. And the beginning of Jesus' enemy list really and truly probably begins here. Those that later will be a mob who will try to assassinate him. They will try to stone him. And more than a few times does he have to run for his life. But the enemy list grows, led by those scribes and Pharisees who do not see him as the Son of God. They see him as a blasphemer. That's the word that they use, that you're practicing blasphemy. And so they want to get rid of him because he's a threat to the power establishment of the Jewish hierarchy. He must establish that he is indeed God's son, and that's one of the ways that he does. I mentioned at the beginning of class, if we had time, we have about 5 more minutes. And so let me just mention a few things about demons and then mention a scripture that you might want to go back. First of all, do demons exist today? I cannot answer that because I don't know. But I know that Satan is the prince of the demons. And so if Satan is at work, it stands to reason it's possible. Do they inhabit other people today? If they do exist, I'm a little bit more sure of my answer on that. There's a passage in, if you want to flip to the Old Testament very quickly, there's a passage in Zechariah 13:1, which seems to indicate that they would not inhabit people's bodies after Jesus would come. So I know it's hard to find Zechariah, but Zechariah 13:1, if you'll want to flip over there. And he says, Zechariah says, on that day, talking about the time of Jesus, there shall be a fountain open for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanliness. And on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will cut off the names from the idols from the land, so that they shall be remembered no more. And I also will remove from the land the prophets and, these words, the spirit of uncleanliness. So it seems Zechariah is saying, at least the way I read it, that spirit of uncleanliness will not be passed on once Jesus and the apostles, once they have passed away, and Jesus is ascended back to the Father. So it has to do with Jesus. So if I read that correctly, it seems to indicate that there would not be possession of demons by people. But again, that doesn't answer the question about do they exist. So let me just run through some things about them. They like to be near dead bodies, and we'll talk about this later, or tombs. They have unusual strength usually. They can make a person unreasonable or immune to sensible persuasion. They cause excessive crying, or they can. They can cause sadistic and masochistic behavior. They have an affinity for heights. They seem to like heights. They recognize Christ as the Son of God and appeal to him in some cases. They know they deserve torment and they dread it. Some of them have names which are revealed in the Scriptures. Remember, Legion is one of the names. It is one of them called himself. More than one can possess the same body in the Bible. They usually desire to stay in the same region of the country. In other words, they tend to stay together. They would rather indwell in an animal body than no body at all. They can cause animals to kill themselves. You remember the pigs in the Gadarenes when they went down the hill and into the water and drowned? And so they can cause animals to kill themselves, as I said. They desire to be in a body when it dies, but of course they can't have that body to move and walk around if that's the case. They seem to have a desire for water for some reason, and they can cause dumbness or unable to speak, deafness. We used to say deaf and dumb. Thankfully, we don't use that anymore. Mute. They could cause muteness. They can cause almost rabid, animal-like behavior, which they do many times. They can indwell from childhood all the way through adulthood. They can cause suicidal behavior. They resist leaving a body. And when they do, many times they rent or tear the flesh of the body. There are different kinds of demons. Some have more power than others. Some can be removed by power and fasting of believers. So that's just a few of things about demons. So we're going to be reading more and more about those because Mark is filled with Jesus casting out demons. Next week, we're going to be talking about Sabbath healing and hard hearts. And if you'd like to read ahead so you know what we're going to be studying, we'll be in chapter 2, verse 23, from where we stopped tonight, through chapter 3, verse 35. So that's chapter 2 of Mark, 23 and continue to read to chapter 3, verse 35. Thank you so much for being here. You're a great encouragement to me, and you're my Barnabases. I appreciate you. And have a great week, and we'll see you next Wednesday night, and you folks on streaming as well. Thank you so much.